I was around 14 or 15 when this happened, and I'm female for anyone who wants to know. There was a park where I used to go to whenever I'd have a row with my parents, which was quite often around those times. This meant I would turn up there in the middle of the day, middle of the night. There was no real pattern to it, and nothing really weird had ever happened before this night. I tended to sit on a bench which was right at the back of the park, right by a wooded area, as I didn't want anyone to see me crying. Of course, I realize how stupid this was now, but back then I was young and really unhappy. It must have been about 9 or half past at this point, and it was just starting to get dark since it was summertime. This guy came over and sat down next to me. Now I know what you're thinking. That would not normally be that weird, but this guy had just come straight out of the woods rather than from the direction of the park. The other odd thing I noticed was that he was wearing a t-shirt, shorts, and these black gloves. He must have been around 40 years old, I think. I'm not sure though. I've always been rubbish at reading ages. He was 6'5", quite stocky and a bit fat as well. The man immediately asked me what was wrong, which embarrassed me quite a bit. I can't even remember what I said in response, but it was probably fairly hostile. I didn't want anyone to see me like that after all. He then commented that I was really tall for a girl. I was about 6'2" back then. He then kinda laughed creepily in my ear and whispered, "I'm bigger though." I always tend to listen to my instincts, and this guy was reading about a 7 out of 10 on the freakometer. I decided it would probably be best to just leave. As I went to stand though, he reached out, as though to grab my arm or something. He smiled at me once more, but it was one of those smiles that don't reach your eyes, so they just look wrong. The man asked me to sit back down, and demanded I tell him what was wrong. Instead, I told him my dad was waiting for me, and I had to leave right now. He then said he knew my dad was not waiting for me. He'd watched me walk into the park from the main road by myself, and liars would be punished. At that point, I just turned around and ran. Back in those days, I was fairly quick. Instead of running in a straight line, I weaved through the playground equipment, figuring it would be harder for such a big guy to get through those tight spaces. I got to the other side of the park and turned around to see if the man was still nearby. He was standing over by the slide, just kind of watching me. I also noticed at this point there was another guy standing right at the edge of the wooded bit. He would have basically been right behind me while I was sitting down on the bench. Neither one of them attempted to chase me at this point, and I ran out onto the path that led to the main road. There was a van parked in the car park, but at that point I didn't connect it with them. When I got out to the main road, it was fairly busy for that time of night, and I finally stopped running. I decided even with everything going on, it was best to go home at this point. About halfway there though, I saw the van from the car park on the road right behind me. It never attempted to overtake anyone. It just kind of continued on the same route as me. I turned off down a road that was near my street, but not actually on it. After a couple of minutes, the van turned down as well and parked just at the top of the road. No one got out, but I could see what I thought were 2 people inside. At that point, I was extremely afraid to head home, as I thought they'd find out where I lived. My parents often left me on my own as well, as they were neglectful douchebags. I knocked on the first door I saw, and thankfully a kind old lady answered. She took me inside and helped me call the police. By the time someone came though, the van was long gone. They never did catch either of those guys from the park, though I'm not sure how hard they looked, as they hadn't specifically done anything. I hadn't thought to take a note of the van license plate either, because I hadn't associated it with them at first. To this day, I still have no real idea what they had planned, or if they were just trying to freak me out or what, but the gloves and the van make me think it could have ended very badly for me. To give you a little bit of backstory, I live in a small town called Belton in Texas. I'm an 18-year-old guy, and I weigh about 195 pounds. I'm 5'6" and somewhat athletic. I played football in high school and know a little bit of martial arts as well as some boxing, so I know how to take a hit. I always carry a pocket knife on me for work as well, and just in case anything were to happen where I would need it. Anyway, this all happened a couple of weeks ago, after I'd just gotten off work from McDonald's. It was around 12 a.m. or so. I had to walk home because my mom was out that night with some friends having fun. Now, my house was about an hour away walking distance, and halfway through there was this park. I stopped at the park along the way. I was fairly tired from work and I was hungry as well. After work, I usually like to take something with me to eat on the way back. I sat down at one of the park benches and started to eat my food when I noticed 3 kids playing alone at the park, all of them boys. At the time, I remember thinking to myself, man, shouldn't these kids be at home sleeping or something? I brushed it off then. Those kids were allowed to do whatever they wanted. I continued to eat my food and mind my own business. After all, I did used to sneak out of my house with my friends when I was younger too. I started to get on my phone and was just about to start listening to some music when I noticed that I could no longer hear those kids playing in the background. I looked around and noticed that now a man was talking to them. At first, I thought it must have been one of the boys' fathers, perhaps worried about them and picking them up. As I looked a bit closer though, I noticed the man who was illuminated by the street lights. I saw he looked kind of dirty and greasy. Focusing a bit more, I could hear the man now offering the kids candy and such if they'd follow him over to his car. At this point, I knew I couldn't let this go on any longer. I walked over to those boys and I asked the man what he was doing. Why was he trying to trick these little kids like this? He played dumb, but I surely was not buying this. Now I was face to face with this guy. He was much older looking than I thought he was. Maybe in his early 40s even. He was 6 feet tall and even a little more muscular than I was. He had a scraggly looking beard and a couple of missing teeth as well. Again though, I stood my ground and demanded to know what he was doing. He told me it was none of my business, to which I replied it was if he was going to mess with these children. The guy inched his way towards me, clearly trying to pick a fight. I pulled out my pocket knife and told him not to even think about it. I told him he had 5 seconds to get out of here or I would shiv his stomach till I was bored. I'm not a violent person, and I didn't really want to risk a fight with this guy, but I knew I couldn't back down at this point. I started counting down. 5, 4, 3, inching my way closer to him with each count. The guy clearly was freaked out. He turned around and ran to his car, which was parked a few yards away from where we were. I gave chase, just to make sure he actually left. I kicked the side of the man's car until he pulled off and hauled ass away. I did try to get his license plate number to report it as well to the cops, but there was not one visible, at least not one that I could see on the back of his car. I offered to walk those kids home. It was a little ways off from my house, but I was willing to make a side trip to make sure that guy didn't come back. It turns out 2 of the boys were brothers. I dropped them off at their house and told their mother what had happened. She thanked me and I told her to call the cops right away when she got the chance. I then took the other kid home. He lived in somewhat of a more sketchy neighborhood. Anyways, I get the feeling we were being followed, and I was right. That same man was either by pure coincidence or through vigorous stalking, now following us in his car. He wasn't directly behind us. He was sort of a few yards away, quietly slinking behind. I took the boy to his house, but like a dumbass, I forgot the man could just try and attack us. He sprinted out of his car and knocked me over to the ground. He was clearly going for this kid, trying to grab him and run away. I grabbed the man's ankle and made him trip, and screamed at the kid to run for his house. Me and the man fought it out. He was much stronger than I had expected. He pushed me to the ground again and pinned me. He tried to reach into my pocket and grab my pocket knife. I fought like hell trying to get him off me, but he was too heavy. Luckily, the kid had managed to get some help. Just as if on cue, the cops pulled the man off of me, then put him in the cop car. One of the officers asked me some questions and asked if I was all right. I also accepted a ride home. I was extremely tired after everything that happened, and I didn't feel like walking all that extra way. The kid's mom, I assume, called the cops. She thanked me and asked if I was alright too. I told her I was fine. I was thankful that she'd call the cops. I told my mom the story the next day about what happened. She was just thankful I was alright. I found out later the man was sent to prison. I thought to myself, good, he deserves to rot for that kind of thing. Apparently, this was not his first crime, nor his first act of attempted child molestation. When I was younger, I lived in the suburbs of Chicago with my parents and my little sister at my grandparents' house. We used to be a very close family, always getting together for birthdays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, etc. That was until they all became money hungry and held grudges against family members who couldn't get the money back to them right away. My story takes place on March 28, 2000. My family and some family friends gathered to my grandparents' house for my dad's 30th birthday. It was a surprise birthday party. I sometimes really hated when we had family gatherings because everyone would always ask to see how my front teeth were growing in. I don't remember exactly why, but when I was young, I had to get my 4 top teeth pulled out when I was real little. Everyone always made fun of me about how cute it was, because I'd always sing "All I Want for Christmas is my 4 front teeth." A couple of hours into the party, my sister and my cousins and I started to get really bored. We couldn't play my Nintendo because everyone was in the basement drinking, playing games, and watching whatever football or whatever was on at the time. We asked our parents if we could go to the park right down the street together. The best part of the park was about a 4-minute walk away. They were a bit hesitant at first since it was already quite dark out, but they said we could go for just an hour, as long as my cousin Steven, who was 12 at the time, would watch us and make sure nothing bad happened. We walked over to the park extremely excited. We started off by playing on the swings together, competing to see who could swing the highest. My cousin Steven had a bit of a late start, because he had to push my little sister to get her going. Very quickly though, we got bored of that game. We decided to play what every awesome kid plays every now and then, lava. We mixed it up a bit and added Shark Attack in there as well. Just a bit after we'd started playing though, a guy that looked to be about my dad's age strolled into the park on a bicycle. He started to talk to us, but my big, brave cousin told him we weren't allowed to talk to random strangers. The man tried to tell us he had just been with my cousin's parents, and he'd only come by to check up on us and hang around to make sure nothing bad happened. I didn't remember seeing this guy at the party, but I listened to him anyway. I don't really know what we were all thinking. I guess there were a bit too many people there. I figured he really could have come to the party a little bit after we left or something. The man asked what we were playing. When we said Lava and Shark Attack, he gave a weird little smile and said, "My favorite games." The guy wanted to join us. He wanted to be the shark. He grabbed my sister, my cousin Michelle and I, and pick us up and spin us around. Of course, we didn't really think anything of it. We thought this guy really knew our parents. After playing for a while, he told us he was getting bored though, and he asked if we wanted to come play at his house instead. He had a Nintendo and a PlayStation we could all play with together. We told him we would have to go and ask our parents because we were only supposed to be there for about an hour and time was almost up. He told us that was fine, but we could play for a little bit longer if we wanted to, which of course we did. Right in the middle of playing Shark Attack and him grabbing my sister in the air, a car pulled up to the gates of the park. I could hear someone screaming, "What the hell is going on here?" I saw my dad and my cousins jump out of the car and start screaming at the guy, who had already hopped onto his bike and started to ride off. My cousins, my sister, and I were all dragged to the car by our parents, with them yelling at us, asking in English and Polish what we were thinking. They started to yell even more when we told them the guy said he'd known them, and that's why we'd been playing with him. 9 years later, I found a website for registered sex offenders. I looked up all of the ones around my area, where I now live in Indiana, and around all of my friends' houses as well. After I was done with that, I looked them up by my grandparents' place too. There had been a sex offender literally 3 houses down from my grandparents' house, and it was that very same guy from the park. I don't remember what it said his charges were, but it's so scary to think he could have kidnapped all of us, or ruined our lives in the park that night. I was 14 when this occurred, and I'm 22 now. I still remember it in crisp detail though, and it freaks me out to this day, thinking what might have happened if things had turned out just a bit differently. School was out for the summer, and I had convinced my mom to send me to Russia for a couple of months to visit my grandparents. We'd moved to North America when I was little, and I hadn't ever been back much since. Plus, I thought it would be fun being on my first trip abroad all by myself. She agreed, and off I went on my first solo transatlantic journey. My grandparents are very great people and have always spoiled my mother and I rotten. They were ecstatic their only granddaughter wanted to visit them, so they planned a fun vacation of their own with me for a month after I arrived, to a popular beach resort city in Turkey. We were to stay at a 5-star resort in Ankara for 2 weeks. I thought that was spectacular, getting to travel to not just 1 but 2 countries in a single summer, and to a fancy exotic place like Turkey at that. I was dying to go. Full disclosure though, when I arrived to Russia, it was not really what I had been expecting. My grandparents are really protective people, so I couldn't do much or go anywhere by myself. That meant it got boring pretty fast, and I spent most of my days just playing PSP in my room. I was very accustomed to being active, you see, and I wanted to do lots of things like go jogging, which I'd done every day at home. I gave my grandparents a bit of a hard time about that, since they wouldn't let me go alone, and naturally they couldn't keep up with me due to their age. After about a month of this, the time came to go to Turkey together. I was super excited to finally get some freedom and a change of scenery. I had been pent up at home for far too long. The resort they had picked was sprawled out over a fairly large area. However, it was all very well secured and isolated from the rest of the city. There was also a huge garden on the property as well, which was very well suited for jogging. This time, I also had my own room separate from my grandparents too, so I took the opportunity to go off by myself and explore the grounds a bit. Most of the time, I would jog in the mornings when it was a bit cooler. I would go with my big old iPod, so I couldn't hear anything that was going on around me. I figured it was really safe since it was a really nice hotel with lots of tourists around as well. Then, I started to notice him, a pretty innocuous-seeming gardener in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing this dark green uniform. I remember he kind of reminded me of like a shriveled old date from too many years in the sun. He would always wave or say something in broken English as I passed by, while he trimmed the shrubs or mowed the lawn. I would politely wave back, smile, and nod, but didn't really pay him much attention. Fast forward through about 10 days of this, and now I was really enjoying myself. It was fun to swim in the pool and the sea, the food was really great. And my grandparents had eased up a lot so I could do a lot more by myself. They didn't know about my morning runs in the gardens though, and I was not going to tell them because I was sure they would not approve. One morning around 7 a.m. while I'm jogging, I see that gardener again. This time though, it's clear he's trying to get my attention specifically. He waves at me and yells something, so I stop and pull out my earphones, trying to figure out what he wants. Now, I know he works for the hotel, so I didn't really suspect anything. He waved at me again and motioned for me to come a bit closer. I was very confused, but I figured he wanted to tell me something, so I politely approached him. He was standing at the edge of a trail that went deeper into the gardens and off into the foliage. He was smiling and gesturing, and I could see he was holding something in his hand. I noticed he was holding a rose and extending it to me. At this point, I was confused and a little bit freaked out about what the hell he was thinking. I stayed put. Usually, the hotel staff there were chatty but nice enough. My grandparents would always get pulled into various conversations with them about things. I figured this was something of the same like. I didn't want to be rude, but I still wanted to be on my way without offending this old man. He handed me the flower and I took it, thinking maybe he wanted to show me some roses that were in bloom or something. He kept waving and gesturing like he wanted me to follow him, and stupidly I walked a bit closer. He had another flower in his hand and backed away more. Then, suddenly he stopped and started to lower it a little. That's when I noticed he was holding his other hand behind his back, and he was clearly holding something. I looked up ahead to the trail to see this little hidden-away cabin type thing where I assumed they kept their gardening supplies. Something clicked in my head then, and I began to slowly back away. The man saw me do that and tried to smile, then moved the hand he'd been holding behind his back while lunging toward me. I saw he was clearly holding some kind of rag. Without hesitation, I dropped the rose he had handed me, turned around, and sprinted at full speed. I didn't even stop to look back. I just ran like mad back to the hotel. It was not until the doors closed behind me, and I was among other people, that I looked back to see if the man had followed me. I couldn't see him anymore though. My heart was beating like crazy. I went back to my hotel room and waited for my grandparents to wake up. I never told them about any of what happened that day and spent the rest of my vacation glued to their side. I thought if I'd said anything, they would get even more paranoid about my safety and blame me for wandering off on my own. Also, I really loved them and I kinda didn't want to ruin the remaining days for them. I saw the gardener once more on the beach. I remember seeing him talking to a security guard. I grew very uncomfortable and sunk into my sun chair as I saw him. He looked over to me and smiled. I scowled at him as he mouthed the word Rosa tauntingly and smiled again. I still remember the anger bubbling in my stomach and how much I wanted to cleave his face in. I just froze there and stared though. He walked away, and I went back to pretending nothing ever happened. Needless to say, I never went on any more morning jogs, and neither did I want to until long after that summer had ended and I returned back home.